And listening in on that is advocacy specialist at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, Gugu, Nonjinge, and Professor Karl von Holdt, who is a senior researcher at the Wits University of Sociology, and he's with that department. And so I would like, for the purpose of this conversation, for us to perhaps take a look at the violence that followed the taxi strike or the taxi stay away in the Western Cape. Taking a look at this country, and whenever there is something of this kind, violence then follows, especially in the most underdeveloped areas, being the townships of Cape Town, when you take a look at this particular situation. Gugu, let's start with you, because you would have heard the Minister of Transport speak about the right to strike, but to strike peacefully. What is the psychology of destroying infrastructure that people will need to use again tomorrow when there is a situation that is not pleasing to some?
I think more than anything, it is for us to locate the history of violence in South Africa and better understand that. The current looting phenomenon now has been sort of akin to uprising of the poor, that is mostly said brought by acute food insecurity, which our research findings has actually found that we can't necessarily attribute that alone. I mean, the looting to food insecurity alone. There's many other aspects or many other factors that we need to look into. Looting in South Africa, for example, has taken place for quite a long time. It did take place during apartheid. It also continued after democracy in 1994, but it has traditionally been in the areas that you're mentioning, in peri-urban areas, marginalized areas, and also some urban areas. And I think more than anything, it speaks to the way in which we believe as people, or the psyche, that by taking part in a violence, we are forcing, or rather we are making our voices heard. So it starts from there, from the history of violence, in the sense that this is how we, before 1994, sort of fixed things in our communities. So I think it speaks to the normalization and the widespread sort of tolerance of violence in the country, which is a critical issue in itself.
Professor von Holdt, the normalization of violence in South African society, what has been your observation?
Well, Dudu, as Gugu says, there's a long history of violence in South Africa and a kind of habituation to use of violence. But I would want to stress as well the current situation in which we have a government which is often unresponsive to peaceful protests. And we often hear in the work that we do that people say, violence is the only language that government understands. And I think that's also become inculcated as a sense of how you escalate a strike, how you get a response. And then there's also the real importance of the depth of inequality, poverty, and unemployment in South Africa. And this leads to a widespread sense of injustice and grievance that people have, that the current order of things has got a certain illegitimacy, notwithstanding that it's a democratic government. And this applies specifically to the law. And if I can, I'd like to quote to you one striker, not in this strike, but in another strike, who said to me, of course there has to be laws against violence and laws against assault. But if we are on strike, if we obey that law, we'll never win our strike. We have to set the law aside and use violence. So you can see the many things that are happening, in that quote. And so I think these things all contribute to the prevalence of violence. And then I do think that specifically in this situation, we have to mention the prevalence of guns in South Africa all over the place. This is made use of in this kind of violent conflict. And I mean, personally, I think that the only way that we're going to get rid of that element of the violence is by banning guns altogether, making them illegal.
Professor von Holdt, you speak of the depth of inequality and poverty in South Africa. Yes, South Africa is said to be the most unequal society in the world. You take a look at our neighbors, and I do beg your pardon if this is not even a fair comparison. Zimbabwe, for instance, Lesotho, for instance, that's also where you find inequality and poverty, maybe not at the level that you find in South Africa. But if people in those countries had to burn that country down, those countries down, they wouldn't have existed. And so is it really a fair assessment to speak of inequality and poverty also driving the violence, where tomorrow you're going to need the very same facilities that are being destroyed on the day of protest?
Yep, I think those are very fair questions, and they raise a lot of complex issues. But I would say here that this goes back to the point that Gugu was making about the history of violence in South Africa and its kind of prevalence as a resource to people and to communities to use a certain kind of habituation to violence, which some of those other societies to that extent. And I think that the other aspect of this is that, I can't say about the countries you mentioned, but certainly in South Africa is this deep sense that apartheid produced this kind of inequality and this kind of deprivation, and we haven't yet got out of it. And over the years under apartheid, there was a real illegitimacy of the regime, the kind of law was illegitimate and so on and so forth. And that's all carried over into the new situation in a way that creates a real, a real kind of violence in everyday life.
Okay. Gugu, as we speak, we're showing our viewers some visuals. We were in Nyanga for our viewers yesterday, and there was a car that was burned down, and there were little children because they haven't been able to get to school because of the taxi stay away and the impasse between the city and Santako. And they were taking some pieces from this car that was burnt and is just now in the middle of the road, and nothing is being done about it. And it's during the week. You've got some children who are at school. And so when you speak of the history of violence in South Africa, where do we begin to shift or change the mindset, if we can, right? So these children who are growing up, who are in the middle of the streets in Nyanga, who are picking at a car that was burned, do not have to suffer the consequences of what was inherited in South Africa, or what people from these parts of the world, the so-called forgotten of South Africa, inherited.
I definitely want to agree also with Prof, and to touch on your question, that in order for us to be able to address these effects of violence in our communities, in our country, we need to understand all these multiple and intersecting factors that converge and result in violence. I know Prof spoke about the social and economic inequality. One thing we need to get straight and both understand is the fact that colonialism and apartheid continue to mark South Africa's society, right? And the socio-economic sort of inequality that we currently experiencing now still follows racial lines in South Africa. So there's quite a lot of these factors that we need to look into, followed by the lack of social cohesion. And I think in order for us to also address, we also need to start going back to the basics, dealing with the lack of social cohesion in our respective communities. And in South Africa, we need to go back to talk about all of this inequality that is obviously within racial lines. It starts there, the dialoguing, that meaningful dialoguing that needs to happen, the unlearning and learning. I think racism as well is still playing a part in the way that people are retaliating, in the way that people are acting. On Friday or on Thursday, we had people walking 35 kilometers from the city of Cape Town to their respective communities or to their respective homes due to the lack of transportation. It speaks to the spatial planning that was from apartheid. It speaks to the way that the city is designed, that it is not pro the ones that are working and middle class that are working, or rather poor that are working in the city and living far from the city. So it is not designed for them. So we still have quite a lot of those issues that before we can even start speaking about how do we ensure that people do not loot, but we still have those structural problems that we need to deal with as a country before we can be able to move forward.
In South Africa in 2023, how is that going? Because even just at maybe micro levels, right, with it doesn't matter where you are. Let's say maybe you're at a shop and you bump into someone, or you see something that makes you uncomfortable. There's an interaction where you're like, this should not be happening in democratic South Africa, where there's allegedly social or apparently social cohesion. So from micro levels, where you and I as South Africans have these kind of conversations, how is that going? What's your observation?
The organization that I work for is the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, and we studied reconciliation patterns. We have barometers like the South African Reconciliation Barometer, who actually show things like people do not even trust their neighbors. Right. So there's quite a lot that still needs to happen. And unfortunately, this is what the TRRC missed, in the sense that we can't just forgive and forget. We have to meaningfully engage people. We have to dialogue with people. We have to fully understand so that we can learn and unlearn things that have been instilled in our mindset and our way of living. So I think for us, it's also put on a personal level, and never mind in a community, because that's quite large scale, to also teach ourselves in terms of how to engage with other races and how to engage with other people that might not necessarily be in the same socioeconomic class as us in the way that we see ourselves. So there's also quite a lot of work and education plays quite a big part into it. It's not just a problem where we can just say, okay, cool, we're giving people money. That's not going to fix anything. There's a deep-rooted, seated things that we need to unpack as a country and as a people in order for us to move forward and deal with these things that keep on erupting.
To both our guests for your contribution this afternoon. Advocacy specialist at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, Gugu Nonjinge, and senior researcher at the Wits University Sociology Department, Professor Karl von Holdt.